Classification when you go to the penitentiary is everything in regards to survival of making it through your prison sentence. Many people are very interested in knowing how certain types of criminals will survive their sentences. How is Chris Watts going to be treated on the run? Will Chad Dorman actually make it through the first time visiting the yard? I'm going to break it down for you. This is in my wheel of knowledge because, as many of you know, I'm an ex-con. My name's ARHayes. I've been there. I've done the time. I've been released. I've violated. I've gone back. I've done more time. And tonight, I'm going to explain how when an inmate hits a yard, the inmates classify him. Not the penitentiary, but the actual inmates and how they determine whether someone's going to stay on the yard or they're going to be helicoptered off the yard. And I know many people out there in your minds, you know that the actual justice in many of these cases happens within the prison politics. People go through the court system, beginning with their initial arrest, their arraignment. They get indicted. They sit in the jail awaiting their court and trials, whether they plea bargain or they actually take it to trial and try to win, and they methodically work their way through the system. Jail and the housing system and the way people are treated in an actual county jail is far different than what happens after an individual is found guilty, sentenced to the penitentiary, and actually sent on their way to go through the entire classification process and onto either a general population yard or protective custody segregated yard. And people need to know the differences and why things happen. I think it's a very important educational value, because then when you think about people when they're going through the actual process and getting found guilty of these horrific crimes that they commit, trust me, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not about everybody getting off on charges. If you're guilty, you're guilty. And if you've done something so horrifically bad as what many of these individuals have done in their lives, trust me, the wrath of the penitentiary is what everybody should pray for compared to a life sentence or a death penalty case. Your death penalty sentence could take 30 to 40 years to actually enforce the judgment of the court and the jury. The penitentiary politics could take all of 1 minute. All of 1 minute. But I'm going to break down for you the concept behind what actually goes into the decision of when someone comes on the yard and whether they make it or don't. I know it rings through a lot of people's heads. A lot of people look at the various different cases and the people being accused of them, and they may just not quite understand the end result of what's going to happen to that individual. They may really think it's going to be one thing, and it turns out to be something completely different, and it will shock you. Because it's prison politics. It's not like the real world. This isn't how law enforcement does their investigation, arrests somebody, sends them through a judicial court proceedings where 12 jurors come to an end result decision on their fate of their future. No, that's not how it works. The politicalness of how the penitentiaries run things is the actual end result decision and actual conviction of people involved in crimes. Perfect example. Let's just look at it. Let's throw it out there for what it may be. Chris Watts. Convicted murderer of not only his beautiful wife, but also his children. People think because of his crime, that's why his life is on the line in the penitentiary. People are going to want to get to him. Part of it, that is part of it. And that's why Colorado, when Chris Watts was convicted, had to transfer him to Wisconsin to serve his time for the time being. He'll be moved many more times. But right now, he's at Dodge Correctional Facility in Wisconsin, far from Colorado. There's a lot of reasoning behind that. Yes, his crime was considered just against the rules of many people. It's sickening to the stomach, and I get that. Me, being where I'm from and how I visualize things, would have had major issues with Chris Watts, and I would have handled them. The first opportunity I got, whether he got me or I got him, it was going to get handled. Because I didn't believe that his crime was something that a real man with integrity and the actual respect of women and children would ever commit. But that's not the entire reason why Chris Watts would actually be politically on death row, even though he got a life sentence by the courts. The judge's decision was a life sentence plus many of consecutive years. That wouldn't be the sentence within the penitentiary. It's going to be for a different reasoning than what many would think. Of course, we look negatively upon the crime that he committed. However, that happens every day. We see those people come in and out every day. No matter how sick to our stomach it is, it doesn't stop. It continuously happens. But what got this man into the trouble he's in is very simple. And I'm going to compare it to another case that's actually going through the system right now in Chad Dorman. Many people are up in arms. This man hunted and killed his own children. He shot his own wife and devastated his daughter's life in the entire process. But it's different than the Chris Watts case, and I'm going to tell you why. This is how things are viewed differently within the penitentiary when it comes down to making a decision on who could stay and who's at risk. And it's a very simple equation. And it may change because the Chad Dorman case is not completely over. It's still going through the process, but there's a difference. And I'm going to explain that to you. And it's actually very simple in the mindset of somebody that's been where I've been compared to people that look at it in a more realistic, everyday, real world visional view. Chris Watts took the life of his wife and his 2 beautiful daughters with an unborn child. He's going to look more negative in the eyes of people within the penitentiary for one reason and one reason only. He was willing to speak to authorities, for one. That's a part of the reason. It's one reason, but it's an entirety of a reasoning. He was willing to open his mouth and speak. But 2, he actually, in return, laid the blame onto his wife. That his wife took the daughters' lives, and then he, in return, took her life. No, 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 no. Snitch, 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 snitch. And people would say, well, he didn't tell on anybody. What do you mean he snitched? He didn't tell on anybody. Yes, he did. In the eyes of people within the penitentiary, 1, he was willing to speak to law enforcement openly. But 2, he was willing to point the finger at somebody else. Now, it doesn't matter whether she was involved or did it or didn't do it, which most of us in our gut are more intelligent than what his whole story would lead to. We know it's all bogus. We know it. We get it. Law enforcement had him nailed and pinned down from the very get-go. They were intelligent enough to know to work through the stages to get everything out of that man's mouth. And I'm not talking about whether Nicole could have possibly been involved as a girlfriend. What I'm saying is they knew the route they had to take to break Chris Watts and get him to talk. Not only to get to talk, but he tried to deflect to somebody else. That's a no-no, ladies and gentlemen, not only within the penitentiary, but it's a no-no in the investigators' minds because they now know for a fact, because these people are intelligent what they're doing. They do know. Those with the major experience know how to break down most of the newbies to the criminal world, but even more so, they can attack those that have been in the criminal world for a long period of time. It's just a methodical way they do it. But they turned that man into a talking, just rambling, bambling moron. They gave up all the clues, and it got him found guilty. And now he has to sit in the state of Wisconsin rather than the state of Colorado to protect his life, because they know when it comes down to the prison politics, not only was his crime disgusting and unacceptable, but at the end of the day, he was a snitch. So those that are able to work their way through the actual court system and keep their mouth shut. And that was the number one thing I always told myself. It didn't matter if I was innocent or guilty. Do not open my mouth. This is for the better good of not only myself, but the entirety of the defense of the case to begin with. And no, law enforcement does not like that. They are not thrilled by the fact that someone's willing to come in that they, in their mind, probably know dead to rights is guilty, and they won't speak because they can't attack that person emotionally, mentally, or even get info just sporadically out of that person because they're mute, they're quiet. That's the only way, whether you're innocent or guilty, when you're being interrogated, of protecting yourself. They're better in the interrogation room than almost 99% of the actual convicts that get caught constantly within these cases. And I've always said it, the majority of the time, when somebody's willing to speak, they tell on themselves. They close the case. It's just rule of thumb. And that's why when somebody gets to the penitentiary, we require all documentation, not only from your original arrest, which would be considered your door card, but even more so that we want your entirety of discovery and sentencing paperwork that will have everything outlined in it that started from the very beginning to the end of the case, meaning that if you were in a room and discussed things with an interrogator, it would have that fully detailed. And for those of you that feel as though, well, let me tell you a little story. People like to know a little bit from my background. I don't really get too engaged in discussing a lot of things, but I'll tell you a little story about a yard I was on years ago. It was on a very political, racial yard in Arizona, as a matter of fact. It was a max security yard. There was an individual on the yard that was being looked at by the white boys. Obviously, I'm a white boy. And the people that spoke for the yard, that were engaged in the yard, were reading through his paperwork. Because it's mandatory when you get to a prison yard, you have to show your documentation to prove that you are able to be on that yard. Okay. And I probably should stop real quick and explain that. Obviously, when you're sentenced and they classify you and they say, hey, Mr. ARHayes, you're considered to be a medium max, you're considered to be a 4-yard level, we're going to send you to such and such a yard. That's the state telling you what your classification is. That's not the prisoners, the inmates, politics to state that you're welcome there. They may send you there, but that doesn't mean the inmates will accept you doing your time there. I hope you understand what that means. The state decides a certain part of where you go. The inmates decide the rest. And it's the inmates you have to worry about. Their decision is what counts. But anyway, I'm listening to the so-called people that run the yard for the white boys. And they're discussing this gentleman's paperwork. And I knew just from the few discussional moments that I had with this man that he was from the military. He had been released due to mental illness. And after being released, he had fallen into some criminal activity involving narcotics. But as the paperwork was being read, I knew there was going to be a problem. Because within that paperwork, it told a story of him telling on his dealers of his narcotics. And they just happened to be Martians from Mars that had flown to the planet Earth and distributed to numerous people before taking off back to their home planet. Now, many of us would laugh. I think even I did. We would chuckle about that. We would say, look at how he's telling on aliens from Mars. How funny is that? It's not funny. It's absolutely not funny. And I knew there was going to be a problem. And I, having years under my belt, wanted to talk some sense into the people making the decisions. And I knew they were the final decision makers. No matter which way I looked at it, didn't matter what I had to say, they had to be the final decision makers. But it bothered me because I saw the route that they were going. And normal, everyday people like you or I that are sitting out here on the planet Earth, within the cities that we live in, that are sitting in our nice recliners or on our couches, and we're listening or reviewing what's going on, would just kind of chuckle about it. We would say, he told on aliens. That's hilarious. But at the end of the day, within the prison politics, it created an issue because he was a snitch. He was willing to talk to law enforcement and lay out this whole design story. It doesn't matter that it didn't come back to anybody in particular. It mattered that he was willing to talk and tell that story. That's a no-no. Just a couple of days later, after I had sat in and listened to the review of the gentleman's paperwork, and trust me, he seemed like a nice enough guy, but you could tell there was mental illness involved. And I just had this really horrifically bad gut feeling. I had everything within inside me that just felt it was all wrong, and I wanted to do something about it, but I couldn't step in on the decision being made. It was made by a higher power that I cannot go against. That higher power makes a decision, and I either got to fall in line and step out of the way, and what happens, happens, or I got to make a big ordeal out of it, and heat comes on me for standing up to the person that's making the decision. It was sad. We went out to wreck, and they beat that man down and beat him even more and curb stomped him on the basketball court and beat him even more with the rocks and the socks and the locks and the socks, to the point he barely was alive when they loaded him on that helicopter and took him off the yard. I remember sitting in my cell, shaking my head, thinking to myself, I don't get it. But then at the end of the day, I do. And I did then, and I do now. And that's one of the biggest issues that people are ever going to have when it comes into these types of cases. You have another one right now with the Savannah Soto and the Matthew Guerrera, and the two individuals with a third actually arrested today, that all have been willing to talk to the officers. They gave statements. They gave info. It doesn't even matter that they possibly told on themselves. At the end of the day, what matters is they were willing to discuss what happened. They're going to get got, especially in Texas. The political nature of prisons across the country varies depending where in the country you are, because different beliefs and interrogations happen in different places you are in the country. West Coast is very, very strict racial division. You get more on the East Coast, and it's not quite as divided racially, but it's different gangs. You could legitimately have two races that run together and live together in the same cell, where on the West Coast, different races don't live together in the cell. It doesn't happen. But my entirety of the point is, within the jail system, people can actually methodically make it through without their lives being in danger, because cases are not guilty or not guilty. Now, it's different if you have something that involves sexual situations with children or women. That's going to be bad. This would be bad all the way across the board. Doesn't matter where you're at in the country. But if you look at the various cases, people are going to look at the totality of the case in a different manner and accept different people onto the yard that may not be accepted somewhere else. If you don't talk, if you don't point the finger, if you don't lay the blame, you're not looked at as negatively as if you open your mouth and we're just willing to speak about anything and everything at any point in time. So when people, and they ask me how and why certain people live a certain way on prison yards and who's in danger and who's not and how their lives are going to be affected, you have to take the totality of everything intertwined in what's happening. If you're able to keep your mouth shut and mute your conversations back and forth with a law enforcement entity, you're going to be better off than anybody that was willing to speak. Now, if you cut a plea deal and you throw somebody else under the bus, you better hope they send you 5,000 miles away. The only problem with that, it's a very simple problem. Your paperwork never lies. Your paperwork will always tell the story. And when your story gets told, that you have a tendency to speak upon things that you should not speak upon, or blame others for things you should have stayed quiet about, there's nowhere you can hide. Nowhere. The prison politics and the justice system within the penitentiary is very harsh. It can overwhelm many a people, and it's very, very violent. So for individuals that wonder when they look at a case like the Chad Dorman case compared to a Chris Watts case, they're both sickening in their own realms. We know that both parents failed and took the lives of their very own blood and family. But when they get to the penitentiary, they will be viewed differently. They will be treated differently. Does that mean they get off scot-free? No. But they will be treated differently. Unfortunately, I know. Because I'm an ex-con. I've done a lot of prison time. I'm only here to set it straight, just to give you the facts of what it's really about. And it's not a pretty sight in any realm. I'm ARHayes. I appreciate you joining me. We'll talk again soon.